What humans are really good at is observations. Like, you need that human observational input. What humans are not good at is analyzing all those observations to figure out what are clear patterns of what someone's doing well or not doing well. And so if you take all the attention away from the report writing that people do around reviews to just making regular observations, we can give really high fidelity feedback.
Chad Peterman here, and you are listening to Can't Stop the Growth, a platform for leaders and teams to grow and thrive. We highlight the importance of personal development, pursuing greatness, and always chasing your potential. Let's get into it. Hello and welcome to another episode of Can't Stop the Growth. Today, we are going to dive into a subject that we have talked a lot about. It is, how do we build leaders within our organization? It's my belief that the effort and attention that we put into growing our leadership team ultimately grows our companies. And today, my guest is going to help dive into that subject and tell us a little bit about what he does in order to facilitate that, to help companies grow leaders and grow more effective managers. So, without any further ado, would like to welcome the founder and CEO of OnLoop, Projjal Ghatak. Welcome to the podcast, Projjal.
Thanks, Chad. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. I learned that you're in Singapore, so I'm not sure what time it is over there, but I appreciate it.
10:08. Not too bad.
10:08. Awesome. Well, appreciate you being on. I guess maybe to get started, maybe give the listeners maybe a little bit of your background and then go on to kind of what you're doing with OnLoop, and then we can dive into some of the ins and outs of growing leaders on our teams.
Yeah, one of the ways in which I summarize my career is all things non-technical in tech. And right before starting OnLoop in 2020, I'd spent close to 4 years at a company called Uber, sort of global ride-hailing company that probably most people have heard of. And I spent 4 years there through a time of a lot of change and a lot of growth, and sort of had the privilege of leading teams both regionally and globally. I sort of did my MBA at Stanford prior to that, and then started my career as a management consultant in Accenture strategy. And so I've always sort of looked at management from the business lens, but I've always believed that developing people is the only way organizations do scale, and that if you get the most out of your people, that's the highest ROI thing you can do for your business. The tough thing is it's hard to measure, and when something's hard to measure, it becomes hard to manage. But good management, there's nothing more ROI than good management in an organization.
Couldn't agree more, and appreciate you giving us a little bit of background. I think before I dive in, I think there's probably listeners thinking the same thing that I am. If you spent time at Uber, how accurate is the movie?
I chronologically not accurate, but sort of spiritually accurate. And so obviously when something becomes a movie, it gets dramatized. But look, in many ways, what Uber was able to achieve would not have been possible if it hadn't been all-out war. And today we all get to benefit from it. But people went to jail and bad things happen unintentionally. But, if Uber was a polite sort of asking for permission company, there wouldn't have been any Uber today. So it was sort of a side effect for the change that we were trying to drive in the world.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. I appreciate you providing that context. Well, let's dive in. This is the first time I've been exposed to this concept of, and I believe it's you spell it out on the website, of this collaborative team development. First time I've heard that. I would assume that I've participated in some of that, but tell us a little bit more about what is that?
Yeah, so look, when I started the company, a lot of it was based on personal frustration. And the way that organizations have historically tried to manage productivity is through frameworks like OKR or performance management, or, all well-meaning approaches to sort of drive productive organizations. But all of them that I believe have not been successful at actually driving the right behaviors in organizations. And so we sort of set out to rethink of how we should think about bringing out the best in every knowledge worker. And over time, we sort of came up with our own proprietary 5-layer framework of how to think about knowledge worker productivity. And as we thought about those 5 layers, it was really about a team working together to bring out the best in each other. And collaborative team development, or CTD, really felt like the right name for what we wanted that process to be. And so it's a framework and an approach that is proprietary to us, and something that really came through our work with dozens of managers and a few Stanford School professors that we worked with towards the beginning of the company.
What do you see as, because I feel like there's this battle a little bit with what impact does kind of the culture play in the business's, success and different things like that. What are your thoughts on the impact that has within an organization?
I think it's kind of like overused that culture is the most important thing, and culture eats strategy for breakfast, and nothing matters more than culture. Although I think that is accurate. One thing that I've come to realize is that I don't believe there's anything you could call a good culture or a bad culture. What exists is strong cultures and weak cultures. That's one. And then B, there is a match between the culture and the mission, or a mismatch between the culture and the mission, right? So if you go back to the Uber example, if Uber had a culture of, let's call it being nice to everyone, and what is often termed as Googliness, a term that Google came up with on how we're all sort of kind to each other and deeply empathetic, there would be no Uber, right? On the other hand, if you're running a pet care business and you have people in the organization that don't love animals, you kind of have a mismatch in culture. So I think at the end of the day, it becomes very important for a leader to realize, what is the mission you're serving? And what is the kind of people and the kind of values and behaviors that serve that mission? And then if you're able to do that consistently, top down, left and right across an org, you end up with a strong culture. And I think different people fit in different cultures well. I would not do well in a culture that did not have direct intellectual conflict, because I believe beating around the bush is a complete waste of time. And if you have a high trust organization, people can be direct and have productive conversations. But some people might find that abrasive or aggressive or hard to deal with. And I think we live in a world where sometimes it's easy to label one as good, one as bad, right? A lot of I refer to that as the woke movement, or sort of the over-incidence of being politically correct. But my general perspective is, I think every leader gets to decide what culture they want. And when they sort of bring that to life consistently, you end up with a strong aligned culture. When you don't, you end up with a hodgepodge that becomes hard to align everybody and move in the right direction.
Yeah, I think that's such a great point. I was talking about this the other day with somebody about, I've had a number of friends who run very successful companies, but their culture is different. And there's a number of ways to get there. But I think your point about making sure that the people within the organization have the values and, the work ethic or whatever it is that aligns with your culture. If they are completely different, to your example, which I think is so apt, if you got people in a pet care business that hate dogs, you got a problem. You need them to love dogs and cats and, everything else that you're taking care of. But no, I think that's a really great point. When we think about OnLoop, how does it work to maybe align that and get everybody on the same page as to what is the mission and how are we going to attack that mission?
Yes, if I had to dig into CTD a little bit, there are sort of 5 layers to it. At the base of it is sort of what we call energy. So how full is someone's battery? And we think that is the most foundational level to sort of a productive organization. The layer above that is goals. And we define goals as either targets projects or skills, not as KPIs, not as OKRs, not as MBOs, not sort of things that people have struggled to really implement consistently across an org. But you can go to anyone in an organization and ask them, hey, what targets are you trying to hit? What projects are you trying to work on? And what skills are you trying to develop? And every single person should be able to articulate to you what's on their plate. And then we sort of make it really easy to link those goals across various levels of an org. And we call those two layers the base layers of productivity. And typically, if you have an underperforming organization, people often resort to things like feedback. And I'll come to feedback in a second. But I challenge every manager who has an underperforming team who's like, look, my team's not great. They do X, Y, and Z bad. And I'm like, I don't think that's relevant. I think you need to dig down more foundationally and figure out, A, are they motivated? And they may not be motivated for a whole variety of reasons. And B, do they have clarity on what their goals are? And does that link back to what you're trying to achieve? And I guarantee you, if there's synchronicity and alignment in those two layers, you'll at least have an average performing org. And then what matters above that is the two layers of feedback. So one, celebrate feedback, not only to recognize people, but also to really help understand what an individual's superpowers are. And then improve feedback to identify what someone's blind spots are. And then finally, continuous learning and growth. And we believe that if a manager is able to manage that hierarchy bottom to top, they have a high-performing team. And what matters for each team member might differ. And that, even for the same individual, might change week on month, depending on what's going on. But essentially, if you have a motivated workforce that has clarity on what they're working towards and feels like they're learning and growing, you will have a productive workforce. And in that order. And typically, what managers don't like accepting is that their people are just not motivated. And they try and then give them feedback as a way to make them better. But really, the issue is more foundational and underlying. And we practice that every day. And I also coach a few CEOs, and it's been very helpful in my coaching work also, that if I see a CEO not showing up the right way, it's really about investigating bottom to top what's going on. And if someone shows up with an empty battery, getting that person to fill that cup back up is what matters most. And nothing else matters above that. In the same way that if your iPhone's at 25%, you probably don't need to plug it into a charger. But if it falls to 5%, if you don't charge it, it's going to die. At that point, it doesn't matter whether it's the latest iPhone 16 and how many cameras it has and what else it can do. If it's out of battery, it's out of battery, right? And I don't think humans are that much different. And often people think about well-being or wellness, and they use language that is quite antithetical to productivity, and which is why we use the word energy to really think about what sits at the foundation of a productive work. Does that answer the question, Chet?
Yeah, that's perfect. I love the framework, and I've got a couple of questions maybe to dig in a little bit, because I think that this is probably, listeners are probably thinking a couple of things, or at least I am, is, this whole motivation piece. If you're coaching a CEO and he or she is, hey, I just feel like the people that I have aren't motivated, or as we were talking about yesterday in one of our meetings, there's not a sense of urgency. Like people should be, buzzing around and all of this. What advice would you give to that leader?
A is go and survey each of them. Like run a deep 30-minute investigation into understanding what actually motivates each of them. Is it how much they get paid? Is it how much impact they have? Is it getting time to spend with their family? Is it a workplace that takes care of the feelings? Like ultimately, as humans, it's not consistent what motivates people, right? And I've realized that I'm not that motivated by money compared to many of my peers. I'm a lot more motivated by how much influence I have in a room and in the world. And so that often becomes my objective function for when I really push myself versus not. And ultimately, if I'm put in a position where I don't feel influential, I'm just not going to be successful. But on the other hand, there are people who might be motivated by, how close they feel to their colleagues. And that's why in some of those situations, remote work has been hugely detrimental to productivity. Because if someone is motivated by connection to other human beings, if they don't have that connection at workplace, they're just not energized to show up. Some people are then motivated by flexibility. In those places, if you force them to come to the workplace, they're not going to be motivated. And they're going to try and do the bare minimum to try and get back home as quickly as possible. So I think really understanding, and there are sort of 6 or 8. I haven't really done deep. There's something that's on my to-do list to really go deeper into the energy layer and to really structure that out, because I think there's a finite number of things that motivate and energize folks. But I don't think most managers even know what the motivators of each of the team members are. And if you don't know that, you're not going to be able to build a sense of urgency or get your team to go above and beyond, because you don't know what levers to pull. And so my advice would be, go first figure out what motivates them.
No, I think that's an extremely important point. Are there any tools that you would use to do that survey, or, kind of dig deep in there, or things that you've used in the past, or you said you needed to dig into that too? That's on kind of the top of your list. Are there anything out there that may help? Hey, go check this out. This has been useful.
It's a good question. And it can be done one-on-one, or it can be done in a group, right? And it goes back to how overtly you're trying to do it versus not. So if you do it in a one-on-one type exercise, so actually our website, I think has a downloadable one-on-one guide that looks at around each of those layers around energy or goals, what questions can you ask to really understand what's going on? So if you ask someone, look, if you were a battery, how full is your battery today? Between 0% and 100%. And someone might be like, I'm at 80 or I'm at 60. And then you can ask questions like, do you remember the last time you felt like you were fully energized at 100? What did that feel like? And what were you doing? If you think about your last week, can you think about 3 or 4 things that really energized you versus 3 or 4 things that de-energized you? Then you start getting a sense of who the person is and what kind of things actually increases someone's motivation versus not. If you do it in a team setting, you can do it sort of as a team building exercise. And actually, the New York Times had published this thing called 40 questions to fall in love with anybody. And then someone transformed that 40 questions into 40 questions to get to know someone at work. And I think it's available on Google. And what you can do is, in a group setting, you can get to know people better. And one of the fastest ways to create sort of bonds in organizations is to get people to share more about themselves so that they feel more known and then feel more heard. And so depending on whether you're trying to tackle it head on, and the way to tackle it head on is to, in one-on-one meetings, get a sense of where someone's energy is and what tends to de-energize them. Or if you want to solve that indirectly, then it's to run team building exercises that makes each person feel more heard, feel more known, feel more connected. And typically when someone's more connected to a collective, they tend to give it more of themselves.
Yeah, that makes sense. I appreciate you sharing that. I think those are some good resources that people can check out. I'm going to check them out because I think this is one of those things that, and I don't know if you would agree with this, but I think checking people's battery is an ongoing thing because things happen in life. Hey, I'm going through a tough time, or, whatever the case may be. I just had a new kid and, I'm not getting as much sleep, and all of those things I think are things that we need to be constantly checking in on. One of the other things I want to ask you about in your kind of hierarchy, or the way you think about the collaborative team development, is this whole concept of praising people. I feel like it's one of those that we miss out on, and it's so simple, and it weirdly makes us feel better. I think at least it makes me feel better when I get to praise somebody like, dude, you did an awesome job. You're killing it. Keep up the great work. But I feel like so oftentimes people miss that. Why do you think that is?
So what's even more interesting is that when someone's doing a great job, people say exactly that. keep it up. You're doing a great job. Keep at it. When someone screws up, they go into very specific detail about what went wrong and why. And people then add specificity to constructive feedback. And the praise is very generic. And actually, one of the biggest issues with the word feedback is that people immediately assume feedback equals critical feedback for someone else. But actually, there's 4 types of feedback. There's 2 types of self-feedback, which is self-celebration and self-improvement. And then there is 2 types of others feedback, which is other celebration and others improvement. And what is super critical is to be as specific about the recognition or praise or celebrate as the improvement feedback. Because ultimately, people are highly successful and productive when obviously they're motivated. Then they know what they need to achieve. And then they know what superpowers exist in their arsenal to go about achieving that outcome. So for me, as a business, we were in a pretty tough position last year. And the way I got the business out of the hole was by really turning on steroids the number of bilateral conversations I was having with people to find opportunity. And out of every 10 conversations I had, maybe 1 was very useful, 4 were moderately useful, and 5 were completely useless. But because I'm extroverted, because I'm an external processor, that was my way of getting out of a hole. For someone else, that might be super careful planning and then doing a ton of digital outbound to drive pipeline for the business, right? And that might be their style of doing it because that might be their superpower. But the times when I win is when I know where I need to go and I focus my superpowers in that direction. In addition to that, I'm a deeply disorganized person. And I've come to realize that I can focus on that weakness, but that's likely not a good use of my time because I can use my superpowers to overshadow that weakness and then hire to mitigate it. And when people know their superpowers, and there's research around using strengths-based feedback over improvement feedback is actually more productive for improvement in performance, people can then really hone in on what they're good at, what often is called their zone of genius or, their state of flow. Like people talk about flow a lot, and flow is when you're really using your superpowers to achieve something, you lose track of time. And you understand that only through feedback from others. Sure, some of that is self-feedback too. But when you get very specific praise, you get to know what you're really good at. And I think managers do a massive disservice where, obviously, if they don't mention what's going well, but even when they do, not being specific about what's going well. And that's because when something goes wrong, it tends to trigger us more. And people then react from that emotion of you getting triggered because someone has done something wrong versus assuming that when things go right, that's par for the course.
Yeah. No, that's such a great point as far as I feel like we all, to your point, like there's this self-discovery process. When people give us feedback as to what we're really good at, it allows us to self-discover the things that, oh shoot, well, I haven't got a lot of praise on this particular thing. I don't see people really just hammering down that I'm awesome at this. Maybe I'm not. And then I can go to work on those things. And then when you go to work on those things, or to your point, if you're in a position where you can hire that person, but if you're, maybe an individual contributor, it's like, hey, I struggle with this stuff. Like maybe I need to get some help, or maybe I just need to lean into situations where it's going to really test me. And then all of a sudden that becomes a point of positive feedback. Hey, I know this is really hard for you, or this isn't your superpower, but you've been doing a really good job at like kind of handling it and doing better in that situation.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. Let's dive into OnLoop a little bit. I want listeners to understand how this could potentially help in a lot of the concepts that we've kind of talked about with kind of the layering of the collaborative development and different things like that. How does OnLoop kind of help organizations, or what's kind of the mission of OnLoop in helping organizations?
Yeah, and look, as a company, we've been around for close to 5 years now, and especially in the world of work, I don't think we've seen a 5 year period that's been as game changing. And I sort of talk about, three turbines that have really sort of impacted the world of work, I think, in a positive way. One is obviously the shift to remote and hybrid work. And, that has obviously clearly outlived the pandemic. And there are larger organizations that make the headlines about 5 days return to work, but they're largely the exception, not the norm. And I think generally flexible, distributed, hybrid, remote, whatever you want to call it, I think the way we work has changed forever. I think the second, obviously, is the prevalence of AI at work and sort of the ubiquity of AI tools and the pace at which that has shown up. And frankly, that does change a lot of the work that the everyday knowledge worker has done, because a lot of that is sort of summarizing and report writing and written communication, which I think a large chunk of that is in the process of getting automated away. And then the third, which is not quite here, but I predict will be, is sort of immersive virtual reality, whereby in a world where we'll put on some sort of a headset on, and this conversation will feel like we're happening in the same room. And that will further change how people think about geographical proximity. And so our mission has been really about how do you drive peak knowledge worker productivity during a time of very rapid change, and sort of our sort of CTD framework and how to implement that in organizations. We work with companies to train their managers in really thinking about productivity in very simple steps, in then bringing that into their one-on-ones and other cadences. And then we have a range of technology products, from a mobile app through a WhatsApp conversational sort of agent to sort of AI-generated performance reviews, to sort of bring that framework to life and then use the very best of applied AI technology to bring that to bear. So one of the things we got famous for is that we were the first company in the world to automate performance reviews using GPT-3 back in 2021. And we sincerely believe that nobody should be spending time writing performance reviews. Everybody should be spending time on recording unstructured observations. And then AI should be used to convert those unstructured observations into feedback, which is rewriting the feedback in the right format as well as extracting skills. And then when it comes time for any formal reviews, stitching all that together into clear narratives developed by AI. And so OnLoop as a company really sort of became an applied AI lab to sort of assist with knowledge worker productivity. And in recent times, we're also starting to do quite a bit of work to help businesses think through, what AI should be doing and what humans should be doing. And how do you build sort of a hybrid workforce that sort of consists of both human workers as well as digital workers? Because that's very much a conversation that every business is thinking about. And how do you think about a future where you have autonomous AI agents doing a bunch of workflows, you have humans doing a bunch of workflows, and then you have workflows where both are involved. But really, as a company, we're very, very focused on how do we make humans better by helping them achieve their full potential.
Love it. I'm sure listeners are happy to definitely lean into the fact that they may not have to write a performance review ever again. Let's dig in a little bit from a tactical standpoint. So if I'm not writing the end goal, I'm not writing a performance review. AI is going to write that for me. What does my day-to-day look like in order to obviously help generate that?
Yeah, so one thing we've done for one of our customers is we've built them sort of a customized WhatsApp conversational agent that we call Sheep Chat, and that's because their mascot is a black sheep, and so it's called Sheep Chat internally. And what people do within Sheep Chat is record unstructured observations on themselves or a team member. So if it's like, hey, I just came out of this meeting with Chad, like, he completely crushed it in his presentation. I think he prepared really well. I think he answered questions really well. He kind of ran over time, so I think that's something he could have done better. But overall, he really nailed it, right? And sort of you make that very easy through conversational interfaces to record unstructured observations like that, either by voice or text, right? And then when it comes to sort of a self-review for Chad 6 months down the line, we then try and amass all of those observations that exist. Because what we say is, look, what humans are really good at is observations. Like, you need that human observational input. What humans are not good at is analyzing all those observations to figure out what are clear patterns of what someone's doing well or not doing well. And so if you take all the attention away from the report writing that people do around reviews to just making regular observations, we can give really high fidelity feedback. On a continuous basis, because I can convert your observations into specific what we call feedback captures and have that communicated the right way. But then when it comes time for more formal sort of quarterly or 6-monthly reviews, we can stitch that back up all together. And, if you ask people, look, do you have observations on your team members? Everybody's like, yeah, I have a ton of observations on my team members. And that's the real meat on the feedback. And so we kind of turn that process around for companies to rethink how feedback should be done organizationally.
Yeah, no, I think that's so powerful and such a insightful takeaway from, how performance reviews are typically done. I think we'd probably all agree that there's definitely a recency bias in performance reviews because if I manage multiple people, how am I going to remember how they've performed over the last, even quarter is going to be tough. Like, where have they succeeded? Where have they gotten better? Where are they still struggling? All of these things are like, well, let me sit down. I guess you've done a pretty good job here recently, but I'm overlooking all of the things that have actually happened.
Totally. And there's recency bias. The other is something which is called the peak end theory of behavioral economics. So people remember what happened at the end, and they remember what really sort of triggered them at a peak. And if someone did one really good project, they can typically coast the rest of the time because people remember that one high visibility project that they did. And if someone bombed something high visibly, no matter how much good work they do, people will still remember that one thing that they bombed. And so it's not just recency, but it's also the one thing. And that's why so much time in organizations is spent on, look, how do we give you visibility? How do we create these headline projects for you? Which is a terrible way to bring out the best in people. And the person who's just a solid, consistent performer kind of gets overlooked because they're not doing anything spiky. And the reason why there's so much politics at work is that the extroverted male who's good at making sort of visible presentations moves ahead, but they may not be creating the most value for an organization. And so, I came up with a term called eloquence bias, that people who sound better are perceived to be better. And if you think about the root cause of gender issues or minority issues or all of these other issues that DEI tries to solve, it all boils down to the fact that we're terrible at how we measure performance. And if we measured performance right, we would need no DEI initiatives because people would get their fair worth because we'd be measuring them for the right things. And a lot of the biases exist because if you're straight, if you're white, if you're extroverted, if you're male, you just end up being louder in organizations. And people who are more visible get ahead, and people who are less visible fall behind.
Yeah, I think about that. The example that comes to mind, I think it's such a great point, is, like medications. Are we just treating the symptoms, or are we actually getting to the root cause of, you have high blood pressure because these things, let's stop doing those, and then maybe you don't even need a medication.
Totally. The most amount of time DEI organizations spend is on compulsory DEI training that they force everyone to do, right? And if we moved all that money away to actually seeing people know who they are, we'd get a lot more done in terms of equality in the world.
Yeah, no, I think that's such a great point. And again, I think it all goes back to, how effective are we at measuring true performance within the workplace? Is someone actually, to your point, are they providing more value? They may not appear that way on the surface, but if we're able to provide, or more so document that, continual performance day in, day out, this is what this person is doing, this is how they're acting, this is, whatever it may be, we can be a lot better managers of people because we're actually gauging how they are working.
And so many companies end up protecting bad performers because they have a good manager who protects them. And they lose high performers because they have a bad manager who can't protect them. And I see that happening every day at every organization globally, from the very best to the not so great.
Yeah. No, and I think there's the other piece of like, a lot of times your performance is, swayed heavily, or I guess the gauge of your performance is swayed heavily by, does the manager like you? Do you have the same things in common? Do you get along? Or is this person a totally different person than I am and I just struggle to get along with them? And I think it goes back to what we were talking about earlier. You've got to understand what everybody's motivation is, how they're wired, who they are, all of this. And that person may be completely different than you are, but that doesn't mean they can't be productive.
And that's why I often think AI can be a better manager than many human managers. And I look forward to the day that we can actually get AI to do a lot of these things a manager does today, but do them much more consistently than humans do today.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and I think too, this is a great case study on, I think AI, depending on how you're looking at it, gets somewhat of a bad rap. It's like, oh, what's the world turning into? But to me, this is a great use case of how we can use it to actually improve our own performance as managers and allow it to help us, as opposed to thinking it's such a bad thing.
100%. And I think that we all have knives at home that can be used as a murder weapon. I don't think we're using it as a murder weapon every day, right? And every technology has bad use cases, but the applications for AI to be used for good is a much longer list than it is for bad. But like any new thing, it creates fear. And frankly, when you sensationalize, you also get more attention. So I think in today's day and age, actually, because so much of news is consumed through short form video and other ways to sensationalize things, actually young people have a much more negative worldview because they consume news through TikTok, and TikTok sensationalizes everything, typically for the negative. And so much so that the fear mongering around AI is people trying to get clicks, which is why I still read the physical Financial Times, because when someone puts in a written newspaper, they have less incentive to write things in a sensational way. But when your business model is dependent on how many times when clicked or shared on, even the most well-meaning person is going to write things in a way that fits that purpose. And so, there's so many layers to why people believe what they believe. And sometimes I worry about the younger generation and how they tend to consume content and how that skews a worldview towards a worldview that may not even exist, but is true to them because that's what their TikTok feed tells them.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Projjal, it's been a pleasure speaking with you. I think this topic and what you're trying to solve with OnLoop is a very worthy cause, and something that I think a ton of organizations can benefit from. I think if there's one thing, it's, how do we measure performance? How do we motivate people to do, to learn and grow and get better? Because that's ultimately going to propel our companies forward. So appreciate all your insights. If people are interested in learning more about kind of OnLoop and how it may, help their organization, what's the best way to get a hold of you?
No, thank you. I'm a LinkedIn person, not an X person. And so, if you look for JJ Ghatak or Projjal Ghatak or OnLoop, you'll find me quite easily on LinkedIn. And I love hearing from folks. I may not always reply back, but I read everything that comes through. And so if we can be helpful in any way, or this sort of, triggered any thoughts or reflections, I'd love to hear from folks.
Well, appreciate your time. Appreciate you sharing. I think there's a lot of useful insights in here that listeners can take away and think about. I know I've got quite a few notes and things that I can work on as well. So I really appreciate the time, and thanks for coming on.
Thanks, Chad. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for tuning in. If you'd like to get connected, you can find me at chadmpeterman.com. To see what our team's up to, you can visit petermanbros.com. As always, keep growing out there.